Welcome to the first program in our food and beverage joint webinar series between Nixon Peabody and WSP. Today's program is on OSHA in a post-COVID world. My name is Carl Saul, and I'm an Associate Vice President of Health and Safety for WSP. Today, I have the great privilege of discussing a number of pertinent topics with Rachel Kahn, a labor and employment partner at Nixon Peabody.
Well, thank you, Carl. And this webinar should probably be called OSHA in a post-vaccination world. For anybody who has been keeping track of what Fed OSHA has been doing, you'll know that their newest guidance that has come out is based on the CDC guidance that came out a couple months ago that ultimately allows vaccinated people to go without face coverings in most indoor spaces, and still requires that unvaccinated individuals continue to wear face coverings. So throughout the pandemic, we've seen that Fed OSHA has relied on the guidance of CDC. And here again, it's no different. Their guidance that they released a couple months ago now mostly turns on what employers now must do to protect unvaccinated workers and other workers that are at high risk, so employees that are immunocompromised. So while not a regulation, it is guidance, and we do encourage employers to take a look at it, make sure that you have reviewed it carefully and are implementing the guidance that they have put out. Now, if you're in a state plan state, your state may have other guidance or may have its own regulation, as California does, that would trump the Fed OSHA guidance. So you need to, of course, review what your state has in place and whether or not there's a difference with Fed OSHA. Now, the Fed OSHA guidance of particular importance for food and beverage employers is that they do have high risk industries that they do point out. A lot of it is food processing, retail. So if you're an employer that has a retail piece of your food and beverage facility, there are additional requirements, or I should say guidance, that they do put out. And Fed OSHA has also released a emphasis program that includes many food processing restaurants as high on their list of industries that they are going to be having heavy emphasis on for enforcement purposes. And since, a lot of the Fed OSHA and state OSHA plans and CDC's guidance is revolving around vaccinated versus unvaccinated, Carl, I'm going to turn it over to Carl to walk you through some of the other nuances employers can expect around vaccinated versus unvaccinated workers.
Sure. So when we start talking about vaccinated and unvaccinated employees, especially in the food and beverage industry, we have a major concern about the spread of COVID, especially with variants coming out like the Delta variant that is currently a problem within, across the United States, as we're seeing increases in COVID cases within unvaccinated people. So the first question that we really find, we have employees asking, or employers asking is, can I require employees to be vaccinated? And what's interesting is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of the federal government, so EEOC, they actually have a set of questions and answers that you can find on their website. And that's specifically one of the questions they ask is, hey, can I require my employees to be vaccinated? And the answer is yes. You can require vaccination of your employees. Now, I do understand there's a lot of organizations out there that are a little bit hesitant, whether if there's going to be some legal ramifications. And so if you are going to take that path, again, I'd talk to your legal counsel and of course your leadership and make sure that that's truly the path you want to take. But as I said, the EEOC has said, yes, you can require that. There is two nuances to that, and that is HIPAA requirements and ADA. And so under the HIPAA requirements is any medical records that you receive or anything associated with the vaccination, you have to keep that information confidential. And then additionally, with the ADA, American Disabilities Act, If for some reason somebody cannot receive the vaccination, then you have to give them accommodations or reasonable accommodations. And so, how do you go about saying, yes, you need to be vaccinated, but we're going to keep your medical records confidential if you show us that you've been vaccinated, and then follow those ADA requirements? What we found is what some employers are doing is that they give employees the option. And what I mean by that is say, all right, we've got what we call a green, amber, red system. Green is if you've shown us that you're fully vaccinated, then you don't have to wear, the face coverings, and you don't have to social distance when at work. But we need to have some documentation of that. So it's up to you as an employee to be willing to give us that documentation. If you're an employee who has received one of your vaccinations, or if it's a 2 vaccination series, or if it's, like the Johnson & Johnson, where it's 1 vaccine, if you've received that, but you're within your 2-week, or you've received 1 vaccination waiting on a 2nd vaccination, and you're waiting for that 2-week time frame since your last vaccination to pass, then you're in an amber stage. And so you still have to wear face coverings, you still have to socially distance, but you're in that process to becoming green. And then, of course, people who are in the red zone are those that have not shown that they've received any vaccination, or maybe they don't desire to show that they're vaccinated. And so they continue to wear face masks, and they continue to socially distance. Where it gets a little bit touchy is that, you have to be able to monitor what employees are in that green, yellow, or green, amber, or red phase, while maintaining the medical records, and keeping them, away from other people, and protecting those medical records. So it is a touchy situation, but as far as the answer of can you require vaccinations, yes, you can. So Rachel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Carl. And, to follow up on Carl's point that employers can, for the most part, mandate vaccinations. And even if you are an employer that is not mandating it, but you do have policies that follow the CDC, Fed, OSHA, where you allow vaccinated workers to go without a face covering and to not have to social distance. The question becomes, what type of verification does the employee have to provide to you to verify their vaccine status? So typically, how I look at these policies is that you have a policy that everyone has to have a face covering and everyone has to social distance. The exception is for those that have shown documentation that they are fully vaccinated. And the Fed OSHA guidance does not state what type of verification is required. And some state plans do. Some states have orders, so you should check your local state. But there's typically 3 types of ways of doing it. Having the employee self-attest, so tell you, yes, I'm vaccinated, and you keep a list of that. You don't require additional proof. The second option is to have the employee show you their card, and you mark it down, and then, but you don't keep a copy of the card. And then the third option is that you keep a copy of the vaccination card. And again, it's going to depend by state, which is acceptable, but for the most part, most states do allow employees to self-attest in some form or another, and the employer can just keep a record of that. Some states like Washington, WSHA, their OSHA program requires that a self-attesting be signed by the employee. But employers should think through practically how they want to go about it. As Carl mentioned, vaccination status and vaccination records are confidential medical records and must be kept as such. But I've certainly had employers have situations where, unfortunately, employees have not been truthful when they self-attested to their vaccination status, and it came out later that that they had not been truthful. So you do want to, and I've also had employers have situations where coworkers have not felt comfortable with a self-attesting program, that they unfortunately did not trust their coworkers, to be honest. So these are all practical situations that you should think through about what works for your workforce, what is going to work for you as an employer, and operationally what will work. And I'll turn it back over to Carl to go through some other additional issues he's seen in the workplace.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to touch on just a little bit that Rachel talked about, which is tracking the employees before I move on to some of the other issues we've dealt with. I have seen there are programs out there that employees can go through, and if they've been vaccinated, they can log the dates of their vaccination when they receive vaccination. But there's a series of questions that they would answer to self-certify that they can come to work. That is even without the vaccination. You know, the typical questions we see: have you been exposed to somebody with COVID? Do you have any of the signs or symptoms of COVID? You know, have you been traveling within the past 2 weeks? And so if they have been vaccinated and have vaccination dates in there, then the questions actually just drop down to one or two questions, which is, you know, are you going into an office? Which office are you going into? And are you showing any signs or symptoms of COVID? And if not, then you're clear to come into the office, where if you haven't entered your vaccination dates, you have 6 or 7 questions to answer just to verify that you haven't had exposure. Now, along with that, the employers have stated if you have found not to be truthful, that you can be terminated, you know, because of that. And then what the office managers are able to do is they can actually pull a list of how many people are in the office and then how many are vaccinated versus how many are not. And so if there's 10 people in the office and 8 are vaccinated, but everybody's running out without a mask, then they can request further information to find out who are the employees that are not vaccinated, and take the appropriate corrective action. But then along with that comes with, you know, we have some other situations occurring in the workplace as we return to work. The first one is just returning to the offices. You know, how do you do that? And again, you know, you need to have some type of tracking mechanism if you're going to be tracking employees who are vaccinated versus not vaccinated. Again, while thinking of the HIPAA requirements protecting medical records and ADA requirements if somebody for some reason cannot receive the vaccination. The second is what do you do when people travel? Again, you know, if they've been vaccinated, then your concern is a little less, but you still want to ask that question: are you showing any signs or symptoms, or have you been exposed to anybody with COVID? Even with the vaccine, you probably want to give 3 or 4 days just to make sure that they're not having any kinds of signs or symptoms when they come back into the office. If they've been exposed to somebody or knowingly exposed to somebody while traveling. And then the other is social events. You know, social events are starting to come back around. Again, we prefer to see those outdoors where people can naturally social distance and there's a natural ventilation versus being indoors where you're in a confined. And then again, encouraging that people get vaccinations before they go to social events. And then attempting as best you can to track those. And I think what we need to bring to across with the vaccinations is really encouraging people to get those vaccinations. I know, unfortunately, it's become a political issue, but they have been shown to be very effective. Even with the Delta variant, the people who are coming down with COVID with the Delta variant is less than 1% of those that were vaccinated. And then if you go into fatalities from COVID, again, you're less than 1% of the fatalities are vaccinated people. So you are showing, you know, that there is great success with the vaccines. Vaccines are not 100%. And so, you know, that's the one case people like to bring up, which is, hey, people have been vaccinated, but we're still having fatalities with vaccinated people. Well, yes, we understand that because the vaccines, you know, are roughly 90-95% effective, which means you still have roughly a 5% or 8% of people who are vaccinated that are going to get COVID. But that is such a small portion of the people who are getting COVID, and unfortunately, the people who are, you know, having a fatality from COVID are the vaccinated people. So again, it is such a high level of protection that we'd want to encourage people to receive their vaccines. Again, Rich, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. And just closing out, I think, you know, looking what employers should look at next is, you know, from an OSHA perspective, I think it remains to be seen how OSHA under the new administration is going to be enforcing this guidance. And Fed OSHA is going to be getting a new head, Doug Parker, who is currently the chief of Cal OSHA. So we'll see more of an alignment probably with what has been happening in California, which has been one of the most aggressive state plan states. So Carl, what else do you see on the horizon for employers to keep an eye out on?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is just really going to be tracking the vaccine status of their employees, whether they've been vaccinated or not. Unfortunately, as we've seen with the Delta variant, personnel and staff who are not vaccinated are at the highest risk. And what we really need to be concerned about is not only within the United States, but there's a lot of other countries that have a large portion of their country that's not vaccinated or have received vaccinations that don't meet the same requirements as what we've seen in the United States. And if you have hundreds of thousands or even millions of people still potentially getting COVID, that's more opportunity for new variants to come out. And so that is always a concern, and we need to track that. Unfortunately, if it continues, there could be a variant that would come out which would require a booster shot to the vaccine, and hopefully we don't see that. But the best protection we can get is, again, encourage people to get the vaccine and become vaccinated. It's really the best way we can protect our workforce.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. And if you're interested in learning more about these topics, you can reach out to myself or Carl or visit our company websites. Please also be on the lookout for our next recorded webinar in August that will feature Tyler Savage, a partner here at Nixon Peabody, and Eliza Roberts, Project Director of Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change at WSP. Thank you again.